Hey, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. As I announced on Tuesday, we have two things on our agenda for today. One, to talk again about the final project, the presentation as well, if you have questions. And then I'll be presenting today and then also next Tuesday on the final film and one again of the films that was shortlisted for the final exam. So even though I haven't brought the usual form to collect your notes, I invite you to take notes for your own benefit so that you can review them in preparation for the final exam. For the film, as you see under week 13, there is a link to a separate presentation with images, with a synopsis, a detailed synopsis of the movie that you should review for the final exam, and some notes about the style, about the themes. And the purpose of my presentation today is to emphasize what is important. I'll also compare the film minimally to Trafic Le Mans and to other narratives that we've seen during the semester. And of course, we'll watch the initial sequence depending on how much time we have. It might be 20 minutes or 30 minutes from the film. So why don't we start with questions? Any questions you have about the final project, the presentation? If you have questions about the final exam, that as well. And then I can also add some important points. But why don't you start with your own concerns, doubts, questions?
Yes, can I get the due dates for everything? I guess
The due dates are in the calendar. So I don't remember. I can put them on. I don't remember them off the top of my mind, but we can review them together. Go. Okay, so we go to the page with the calendar. So, of course, we put this first. So, during the last week of the semester, on Tuesday, December 2nd, and Thursday, in lieu of our usual lecture, we'll have presentations, and I'll select if there are volunteers. As I suggested, you can email me, otherwise I'll have some kind of random selection for the half of the class that will present here. That what 2 sessions of 80 minutes allow us to do, since presentation should be about 8 minutes, and then we have to put into this some comments or transitioning from one student to the next. The other half of the class should present on Zoom. And you have dates in here, but in general, anywhere you see this link to Calendly, which is the app I use to schedule Zoom meetings, you can just click. It doesn't matter which day, because then you're transported to the calendar. And of course, there are no dates in November, but if you go to December, that's where you see the options for 6 different days, and the last one would be Friday, December the 12th. When you see a day that might work for you, then you click on it, and sorry, that's the wrong link. Let me get the link for the presentation. Okay, there it is. Okay, so there are actually more days. So you have 9 options, not just 6. When you want to explore one of these days, then you click and you see all the spots that are available. Of course, whenever someone picks a spot, it will be removed. If I need to schedule an appointment or a meeting, those times will be blocked automatically. So the last day to present would be rather December 11th. Okay, so there are 31 students in the class. About 15 or 16 will be able to present in class. The others will have to present on Zoom. I've scheduled blocks of 20 minutes so that we have enough time. Sometimes people who present also have questions about their projects, and I'd be glad to assist. You can also schedule separate meetings about the project. So again, I got to this calendar from this link. The other link was just for the online meetings with me, not the presentations. So the deadline for the completion of the final project is Friday the 12th by the end of the day. And this time, unlike the assignments where files always remained open, in this case, after midnight of Friday the 12th, your Google Docs file will be locked. You'll be able to access the files, you'll be able to view my comments, leave comments of your own, of course, but you will not be able to edit your files after midnight on December 12th, and unless you've requested an extension, and if I grant you an extension, of course, I'll reset the clock for those files. Okay, and please don't request an extension at 10 p.m. on Friday the 12th, because I might not be in front of my computer. We have a final exam on December 16th, which is a Tuesday. I reserved 2 hours, as you can see, 2:15, so that I can put the exams on the desks, let everyone in, etc. And 2 hours, but the format of the exam is just the same as the midterm. 3 questions, you answer 2 of them with short essays. So 2 hours, just to make sure that time is not a factor affecting the quality of your essay questions there. But if you complete the exam in an hour, you just hand in the exam and go to your next exam review session or go home. Okay, so that was the calendar. For those of you who joined, I invited everyone to ask questions about especially the final project, the presentation, but anything concerning the class, including the final exam. Yes, Mo?
Yeah, could you talk more about the presentation?
Yes. So the presentation should not be an exact mirror of your project, right? Your project has a template that you find in the format for the page called Format and Methodology for the Final Project, right? Where you have to start your cataloging of a short story with bibliographical references, a link to the story, brief information about the author, if available, because the author might be, the author's name might be a pseudonym, or the short story might not have an author listed. The important parts for the matrix, for the template, are a synopsis bringing out all the details about the automobile that play a role in the short story, a selection of quotes where you can see significant quotes that provide evidence for the relevance of the automobile in the story, a low-level analysis of the overall pattern in the adoption or rejection of the technology. Is there chaos ensuing after the purchase of a car, etc. For the presentation, you pick one of the short stories that you want to include in the exam. And ideally, it should be the one short story that you find yourself. And then you present some of its contents to the class, or if you're presenting on Zoom, to me. So you could have just a few slides, but with evidence from the story, passages, or a brief description of situations and illustrations, if the story comes with a relevant illustration. And you explain why that story is allow us to understand the representation of the automobile, what happens in the story that is speaking to the consideration given to the technology of the automobile. Is it seen in a positive light, in a negative light? How does it affect the life of the characters, right? The goal of the presentation is not to summarize your project, even if you had it already done at that point. The goal of the presentation is to show that you can talk about the topics of the class in reference to material related to the class, such a short story. So if you want, you can have an outline, a card in front of you, but don't come to read, right? You're demonstrating that you are comfortable with the language of the discussion of the themes of the class. It doesn't have to be perfectly organized. It shouldn't have 12 slides with everything in it already, right? Don't be one of those people who put everything on PowerPoint, because what's the point? You can use PowerPoint, but use it efficiently. For example, if you are discussing a quote or a passage, you put the passage so that others can also follow and understand better. Or you put the names of the characters or some key points, but something brief, and then you just talk. The expectation is not that you will deliver a perfect speech. You can go back if you've missed something and you feel that you forgot to add, right? That's not the point. The point is that you are familiar with the material you picked and you can unpack the ideas, the concepts, the themes of that material, which in our case for this class is one of the short stories. For the project, you need 2. For the presentation, I strongly advise you only limit your presentation to 1 so that you can reach some focus in the 8 minutes or so of your presentation. Okay? We're talking about presentations, final exam, especially the final project. Any questions, anything that I can clarify? Go ahead.
You said we need to use 2 stories for the paper and 1 for the presentation?
No. You need 2 for the project, and one of them should be the focus of your presentation. So it's not external to the project. However, as I said, when you present, you might not have the perfect elaboration of the story that will end up in the project, which I will read myself. I don't need the presentation to double the work in the project that I'll be reading anyway myself, right? And whether you're presented in front of the other students or in front of me, make it interesting. Don't try to make it formal for the sake of your preconceived notion of what academia is. A class is about acquiring writing skills, verbal skills, being able to present material in an engaging way, and especially since you will have the project for a comprehensive treatment of the story, the presentation can be episodic, can focus just on some points and some passages so that you can both engage the audience and show a mature understanding of the story.
So the presentation and the paper can be about completely separate stories?
No, it shouldn't be separate stories. No. I mean, the format is different.
Yeah.
But the
Okay, so
stories,
it's the same story.
what you present in December is one of the stories in the project,
Yeah,
right?
in the paper. You mean?
Yeah. I call it a project because it's not a paper where you have the introduction and you explain your thesis and you get to the conclusion, because there is this template which is like cataloging a story for, think of this as if it were a wiki. A wiki about the automobile where I go to the entry for a particular story and I have the essential information in the story, not the traditional paper
Obviously.
that starts with the automobile was one of the most
Yeah.
beautiful inventions, and
But when you know how you said we have to make it about two stories.
yes, you have to include two stories in the project, and one of them should be the focus of your oral presentation,
Okay, and the other one should be the focus
and,
of.
and both will be in the project.
Okay.
So you come here to talk about one of those stories, and in the project you process those stories in a different way, right? Because in order to present the story to the class or to myself, you don't have to follow exactly the same format. You would go for what is substantial in the story, why you pick the story, and what makes the story relevant for the representation of the technology of the automobile during the early 1900s, and our understanding of the integration of that technology into the society and culture of that time. And you have a question?
Well, I was just gonna say, for my presentation, I was going to do a compare and contrast between the two stories. Is that also okay?
That's possible.
Okay.
I advise against including two stories because it shouldn't be a quick overviews of the story. If you pick that format, it will work as long as you're not trying to put every detail about both stories. And if, let's say you have two stories about characters falling in love through the automobile because they spend time on the automobile, then you have a strong theme that you can leverage to go through two stories. But if you want to present two stories that are slightly different and include also everything that is different about the story, then 8 minutes will never be enough, and the risk would be that your presentation might end up being a superficial treatment of a story. So my advice is, one, if you pick two, be selective, be strategic, and again, everything that is not included in the presentation can find room in the project itself. So don't worry, don't make the presentation a mirror of the project. The contents, the themes, of course, there are things that are aligned, but you're not presenting a project that I'll be reading anyway. What would be the point otherwise if you just came with the project and repeated everything in the project? What else? Yes, Mike.
Where can we find information about the oral presentations?
Basically, what I'm telling you, there is some information in the syllabus, but and I've talked about it, so you can go back to the YouTube channel and find, if you put oral presentation as a search key phrase, you can find and review the segment. But if you want me to repeat anything, so again, it's up to you. There is no exact format. As long as you satisfy the goal of demonstrating that you're able to talk about the material as an expert. You found the story, something attracted your attention, piqued your interest about the story. What is that the story is teaching us about the relationship with the automobile? Take, for example, the story that I use as a demo. You have a couple purchasing the first automobile. They have plenty of trouble. They almost get into a fatal accident, and then they decide to sell the car for pennies. It doesn't matter if they lose money. The story ends with the rejection of the technology. So what are the other elements of this negative representation of the technology? How do we come to the rejection of it? How does it fail to meet the expectation of the users of the technology, right? And then, depending on the story, there might be other incidental themes besides the main theme, right? But you explain what the story tells about the general theme of the class, the representation of the automobile as a new technology, and the interaction, or how does it change the lives of users, okay? And as I said on other occasions, when you're working on the project, when you're looking for stories, if you send me a link, I can tell you this is a great story, this is good enough, or this is not the best story. The card there plays a minor, a very minor role. Okay. And I've been I haven't been on top of my email up to this point, but luckily I've come to the end of a series of workshops administered to offer to Italian teachers that took a lot of my time for planning and logistics, and I'll have more time for emails at this point. I have the final event at the Center for Italian Studies. If you're interested, 5 o'clock, we have an expert on Michelangelo talking about the relationship between his poetry, he wrote more than 300 poems, and his art. More questions? Okay, I'll open the floor for more questions. Oh, sorry, Mo, I didn't see you.
If I volunteered to present in person, would it be possible to get extra points for that rather than on Zoom?
No, but of course, my evaluation would take that into consideration. Meaning, if you're able to engage the audience, and I see that people are interested, or at the end people have comments or questions, that would play in your favor, for sure. Okay. But clearly, I'll have at some point to finalize a list and send it via email to the people in the list saying, you're presenting on December 2nd, or you're presenting on December 4th. And I'll send another email to the others saying, you have not been included in the list of people presenting in the classroom. Please pick a time using Calendly. I'll include the Calendly link. Pick a time for your Zoom presentation. Of course, when you pick a time to present on Zoom, you can reschedule. You will receive from Calendly an email to confirm. Keep that email because there you'll find two options. One is cancel and the other is reschedule. Don't cancel, otherwise you won't be able to reschedule. Cancel is just, I don't want to meet ever. I'm leaving the class, I'm withdrawing. Reschedule will automatically cancel the original appointment and allow you to pick another time slot. Okay? Yes?
Just to clarify, which class sessions will be on Zoom?
No. We'll have our regular meetings in the class the last week, which is, I believe, I put it earlier, it must be December 2nd and 4th.
Yes.
And during those two classes, roughly 15 or 16 students will be allowed to present here in front of the other students. Those who are not scheduled, who will not be scheduled to present in class, will have to go on Calendly and pick a time slot, a slot of 20 minutes, during which they'll present on Zoom. Of course, by all means, I'm here anyway. I'll be coming here even in December every day. If you'd rather present in my office in front of me, I'm perfectly okay with that. So in that case, send me an email saying, I don't want to present in Zoom. I find it too cold, makes me nervous, and you can sit down in my office and present if you want to do that. If you want to bring a presentation, we can put it on my computer, have a screen that I can move, that we can both see. But there is no Zoom class per se. Now, on rare occasions, people have included someone in the oral presentation. If you have someone in the class, not your mother or a friend, but if you have somebody in your class that you would like to be there as audience and for moral support, that would be fine with me. Otherwise, you'll be you presenting and myself listening. And as I said, especially for the Zoom presentation, if there is time and you have questions about the project, you can do so at that point. And clearly, if you need help, assistance with the project, you can schedule a meeting before the deadline, and I'll be glad to help. Or at some point you want to review a draft of your project with me, we can also do that in person or via Zoom. Okay? Am I missing any additional questions? On Tuesday, I'll open the floor for additional questions. Yes, no,
Where
please.
can we find the options for the short stories?
So when you go to the portal of the wiki for the class, there is a whole page about the project. This one, format and methodology of the final project. And in here you find everything you need. You find the sources that can be used for the project, and you find suggestions, you find the template. This is just a naked template with some notes. More importantly, if you scroll long enough, you find the list of examples, and at the end of this list, you find this notation that story number 1 cannot be used by you because it's the one that I use for a demo. And you find my demo in here, my own treatment of the story. But if you want, you can borrow one of the stories numbered 2 through 7. The other story should be a story you find. You can also come and come up with 2 stories and do the project. Okay? Okay. So the crowd roars. Just a brief recap of I've tried to present in the form of diagrams the relationship between humans and machines in narratives that have been included in the class. For a lot of the literary narratives and some of the silent films, the idea is that the traditional human, the boundaries of the lives of traditional humans, their skills should be expanded by machines. That machines create social and individual growth. So you have the traditional human represented here as a circle, but then this circle expands with the help of the machine. The human is still in there, but is potentiated by the use of machines such as the automobile, the telegraph, the telephone, the plane, etc. By the time we get to Traffic and Le Mans, the view is quite different, especially in Traffic 1971. The main idea is that the effect of the use of technologies such as the automobile is negative. Alienation, meaning that I become other than what I am, and I lose what I am in the process. So it's not a positive way. That's why I try to represent it this way. On this side, you have the circle of human identities, skills, etc. On the other side, you have the mechanized version of life with the help of machines. But as you can see, the overlap, the intersection between traditional human identity and individuality and the new mechanized form of life is pretty limited. And by transferring humans in the world of machines, you lose a lot. That's the idea. You lose a lot of what belonged to you as a human being in the process. Le Mans has a slightly more peculiar view where human life and the mechanized life, in this case, the life of drivers driving, racing at high speed, are two separate worlds. But the notion that is conveyed by the character of Michael Delaney is that human life feels diminished, feels incomplete without the machine. That machines represent the other half of the human experience. That to be whole, not to be potentiated, but to be whole again, to feel completely present into your life, completely immersed in the flow of life, you need to recombine humans and machines, which is a visual representation of the famous statement by Michael Delaney, the driver in Le Mans, saying that only racing is living, everything else is waiting. However, it is also true, suggested indirectly by the film, that even when you are completely immersed in racing, there is something else other than that. And that is suggested through the romantic tension and the lightly painted story of the love, or the possibility of love, between Michael and Lisa, the widow of another driver. Is this true? Does this kind of diagram apply to the crowd roars? It doesn't. First of all, the title itself is suggestive of the angle in the representation of racing taken by this film. The crowd roars is something that will be explained towards the end of the sequence that we might see today. And it is also represented on the screen, where you see a lot of the crowds in the race that culminates the film in the conclusion. It's the idea that people go to see races the same way that people went to see the gladiatorial games in the various Roman arenas, such as the Colosseum. That is to say, they're excited by the heroism of the people involved. The gladiators from the past are now the racers. But they're also excited about the prospect of blood. They're also excited about the prospect of a terrible, dramatic accident. So this is the theme that is presented, conveyed by the title. In fact, it's a partial representation of the film itself, which is mostly, as you could imagine, especially for an American film from 1932, a few years after the 1929 Wall Street crash that created the Great Depression era, and right after the end of the Prohibition era. This film is a moral tale, where racing is just a pretext, meaning it's just a context for a story that sounds grandiose, like a myth or a parable. And the characters involved in racing are used just to tell stories about moral redemption, about falling into sin or being tempted into a world, a life of sin, experiencing suffering and loss, and through the process of grieving for the loss of your previous life or lifestyle, finding redemption through a moral transformation that turns you into a more mature adult and a better member of your social community. There are four main characters. There is another one that we'll see in the images, Spad. But the main characters used for the development of the theme in the story are two brothers, Joe and Eddie Greer. Joe is an established racer. a winner, somebody who just won at Indianapolis, a celebrity in this sport. And Eddie, younger brother, is just at the beginning of his career, and he'll be taken under Joe's wing to be mentored because he has talents. And then you find two women who, of course, match the two men in terms of a couple. Lee is Joe's romantic partner. They're not living together. Well, they are, and they have two different places. And of course, the film doesn't tell you about the depth of their relationship. And Eddie and Anne, who's Lee's friend, will be a couple that we'll see emerge from the story in the film. At the beginning of the film, Joe and Lee are already together. And in fact, Lee finds it that it would be the right time for marriage, that she's ready for a commitment, whereas Joe, who's not mature enough for that kind of relationship, rejects the idea completely, laughs at Lee's idea, proposal, suggestion that they should get married. Eddie and Anne are a new couple that will become a real couple, and through marriage experience a positive transformation. So I've tried to schematize this film in a different way that applies to the story of the film through three acts. One is temptation or sin, which manifests itself through the premise and the first third of the film. The other is a process of redemption, but redemption through suffering until we get to the actual transformation. What are the temptations or sins for the various characters? For Joe, the sin is booze. Why is Joe drinking and drinking more and more through the first half of the film? It's not because he's afraid of dying in a race. It's just that racing itself, with these crowds coming to see the drivers, hoping to see a terrible accident that they can tell about, is altogether dehumanizing. And probably you can come up with your own theories, but probably Joe is drinking to fill up the emptiness he feels inside. His other sin is arrogance. Joe is clearly, especially at the beginning of the film, full of himself, but is also a mask that he projects in social interaction or the interaction with his own brother. He pretends to be stronger than he actually is. And of course, booze may play a part in this. He may be, we could also surmise that Joe is addicted to speed, and in the moralistic view of racing, this can be seen as a sin, because after all, what is speeding? What's the value? Is it really worthwhile for a talented individual in the society, American society of the 1930s, to spend time racing or to make a living, to make their whole life around that? Okay. Eddie is not really represented too much in this first phase, because Eddie represents the other end of the spectrum compared to his brother Joe. Eddie is quite naive, very fresh. He's not drinking, but drinking is for him, rather than a sin, a temptation, right? Because he's introduced in a world, which is the world of Joe and the women he frequents, where booze is always present. And also a world with women that are not exactly marriage material. And so that's the other temptation for him, to fall into a superficial relation, and Joe himself is trying to keep his relation with Lee at a very superficial level, even when she, in fact, has grown up of her past and is ready to embrace a better and higher role, that of a supportive wife. Of course, women and wives are represented in this film in quite the traditional, in traditional ways. It's not all traditional, but in traditional way. Potential temptations, of course, are again high speed and taking too many risks for Eddie. But temptations more than sin are represented by the character of Eddie for this part of the act of the film. The two women, you have to understand who they are socially in the social hierarchy of the time. They're referred to with the term dames. So they're not honest women waiting to be married, being supported by their families, and supported and supervised by their family, or being employed, having a job. These are women who enjoy a high level of living, a certain lifestyle of luxury, thanks to the relationship they entertain with men who pay for their lifestyle. They're not escort, right? Don't fall into modern tropes. They're not represented as prostitutes or courtesans or escorts, and their men are not exactly sugar daddies either, okay? However, they entertain relationship with adult men who are wealthy without a long-term commitment in mind. But they're still relationships. They want to have fun, right? But again, don't apply a modern lens. They're not represented as completely immoral female characters. What is that drives the characters through the process of redemption? What kind of force pulls them out of their sinful situation? For Joe is the loss of status. At some point, Joe will cause an accident and the death of a friend, a dear friend of his, another competitor, Spud Connors. And after that, he will lose access to the A game in racing, to the best races and racetracks. However, he will go through the process of loss, detaching himself from his booze addiction. And once he gets rid of his addiction to alcohol, he will become, first of all, humble because he's lost everything. And you'll see Joe dressed very elegantly. You'll see Joe in posh apartments with great furniture around him. Everything will be stylish about the character. Once he loses everything, he turns into a homeless. And he takes the loss with great humility as a lesson, becomes a person who's responsible for others. And that prepares him for the final transformation, which I didn't put there, but I should have. He's ready by the end of the story to really become the big brother he should have been to Eddie, but initially just pretended to be his big brother. And he's ready to become husband to Anne, his partner and companion. For Eddie, the transformation, again, not from sin, but from temptation, right? Distancing from any temptation, not falling into the temptations that I highlighted earlier, happens through love of a mature woman who's supportive and motivates him to become a mature individual, a mature racer, and husband. For the two women, especially Lee is the character that is explored by the film. Lee, played by a great actress from the time who acted under the pseudonym of Anne Dvorak. I have to think about the pronunciation because it's not the pronunciation. It's just the pronunciation that she wanted people to adopt, Dvorak. She acted in other films from the late 1920s, early 1930s. She was great. She herself experiences loss. She loses her luxury apartment in California. By the end of the film, she's working as a waitress in a kiosk, in a racetrack, selling food to spectators and drivers. The transformation comes when she is ready to marry Joe, but before she does that, there will be a tense confrontation between the two of them where she will test Joe. She wants to make sure that he's not drinking any longer and that his mindset has changed. Lee's friend Anne, who will marry Eddie, lives in a situation that can be defined as sinful, right? Because she's exploiting relationship with men to have a good time and to have access to a luxurious lifestyle. Redemption comes from the love of a wholesome boy like Eddie, right? And Eddie and true love will turn her into a good wife for the criteria of the time, that is, say, a wife that is able to support and realize the full potential of their husband, right? Okay, so these are the patterns to be on the look for. In the page about the film, you'll find links to explore the film, the director, but again, the page has a better summary of the film than the Wikipedia page, more accurate and more detailed. Some of the actors' main character, James Cagney, was a great actor from that time and plays the part beautifully, of course, a bit emphatically by our standards, but certainly very well. And Dvorak plays the part of Lee, and there is a website about her that I recommend, and you see some of the other characters. So quickly, at the beginning of the film, we find Joe and his collaborator and the other driver in his team, Spad, working on a car that has been a winning car at Indianapolis and other races. They're taking the car on a train to Joe's hometown. Joe has been away from his hometown and his family for several years. Here we find a staff on the train reading a newspaper, because this will allow us to see the newspaper. It's all show, not tell, celebrating the victories of Joe. They're going to this small place, and on the train, Lee and Joe are about to separate because Lee is not allowed to get off the train because that will represent a step in the direction of marriage, her finally being introduced to the family. He doesn't want that. He wants to keep things cooler. She, in this scene, manifests her intentions for a long time, commitment, that it would be time for a ring to be placed on her finger. And here you see the very stylishly dressed Joe with a mocking face, making fun, poking irony at real things with real values, such as relationships and feelings and marriage, right? And you see that he's a celebrity, but very arrogant and doesn't know what the core value of life in a social community should be. So Lee will continue to California and they'll reunite later. Of course, we see him drink because the premise, we have to see it as part of the premise, and she will scold him. She will tell him that he should not be drinking. as much. So Joe gets off the train, finds his brother, cannot even recognize his brother Eddie because it's been 4 or 5 years since the last time they saw each other. And this time you see that the wholesome character is Eddie and the more jaded character is his brother. They go to their father's garage where Joe will find out that his father and his brother have put together this racing car to introduce Eddie to racing. We see this poster announcing the race that will take place with Joe and Eddie. Joe, the championship and Indianapolis winner, and Eddie Greer, the local champion. And you see that his name is even bigger than his brother's name. We'll see the race. There will be some accident, but not really dramatic accident. At the end of the race, Joe will acknowledge that his brother Eddie is so good at driving that he should continue, leave the hometown, go with him, and race in his team, race for Joe's team, and be mentored and grow up as a racer, but also be introduced to life, right? So we'll see at the end of the initial sequence a telegram sent by Joe to Lee where he says, we're not getting together as soon as we planned because I'm taking my brother to a few races, right, to make sure he grows up, gets his racing education. But clearly, you see that this is the beginning of a split between Joe and Lee. Lee is not by his side, and Joe doesn't feel the desire to get back to her. The split grows even worse. Of course, this is Lee's friend Anne telling Lee, you're falling in love. This should be fun. And instead you're falling in love. Don't do that. I told you that we are not those kinds of women. It gets even worse when Joe finally arrives in town because you see how he's handling her, because he puts her on a taxi and says, I shouldn't come to your apartment because now I have my younger brother. I shouldn't be seeing two people who are not married spending the night in the same apartment. So we should cool things off, not see each other like that, because I need to set a good example for him. And good example is not going with dames, with women who are not proper. But in fact, at this point, she's ready to marry him. She's not the same woman he had met. And this is the immoral situation, the temptation, right? This frame represents all the temptation. Eddie, surrounded by what? You see, all together, you have booze in front of him and dames on both sides. Of course, Lee is already taken by his brother, but you can see the representation, the visual representation of a dame such as Anne, who at this point is not in a relationship, showing legs. This is showing legs by the standards of this time, meaning showing too much legs, right? And practically tempting him, right? Tantalizing him with the sight of her legs. And notice the luxury in the apartment, right? Which is the other temptation, to fall prey, to take risks just to make money. But is this acceptable socially? Joe and Lee separate. He gets angry at her because he thinks that she and her friend are ruining his brother, the morality of his brother. And as a vendetta, to play a joke on Joe, Anne goes to visit Eddie to tempt him, to seduce him, right? To get back at Joe for making her friend Lee cry. And again, this is the temptation. This is a lot of legs by the standards of the time, and he's bamboozled by the view of these legs under the car, and they start a relationship. But this relationship will become serious. This is Joe's friend Spud coming to visit Lee. At this point, Lee is by herself and she's worried about Joe because Joe doesn't have her by his side and therefore he's drinking more, acting more irresponsibly. And she goes to visit her friend who's crying because she has fallen in love. What began like a way to get back at Joe by corrupting his brother has become a wholesome love. She's so in love that she wants a long-term relationship with Eddie. Of course, Joe doesn't want that. The last thing he wants is for his brother to marry a dame such as herself. However, at this point, the two brothers split, right? Because sin and temptations create a divide within families. So you see her behind him, right? And you see from her face that it's not there as the temptress, the seductress, but she's there as the supporting wife. And he, as a mature companion partner, is defending her and their love, and is willing to pick her over his brother, right? Like a mature individual, the mature individual he is becoming. Later on, there is a race at night. Joe is drinking. Spud is concerned about Joe's heavy drinking. Joe is alone at this point. So there is no one to tell him, no, don't drink too much. Again, don't simply connect drinking directly to racing. It's not drinking because he's afraid. It's not that kind of character. And to remind you that there is the risk of death, these baby shoes are the lucky charm, the amulet used by Spud, Joe's friend, to protect him because he has a family and he doesn't want to lose his life, right? Because he feels responsible for his wife and kid. However, in this race, the baby shoes that he usually tucks under the seat of his race car are forgotten. And without his amulet, of course, Spud will die. He will die because of the reckless driving of Joe, because this is what drinking does. Makes you lose the sense of danger. So this is Joe's car grinding against Spud car, because what's the situation, as we will see? Eddie, the young brother, is in front with the car from another team. Joe would like to pass his brother, but he's driving very recklessly. And Spud places his car in between the brothers to shield, to protect Eddie. But he becomes the victim instead. And his car spins, catches fire, and he dies this horrible death. In fact, the stench of burning flesh gets to the nostrils of Joe. And this is the beginning of the end. This is the beginning of the process of loss that will transform him, right? Because now the enormity of what is done comes to him in a very material, physical way through the smell of burning flesh. He stops the car, even though his car was not damaged, and you see him there contemplating the scene of the burning car where Spud has lost his life and he has lost his arrogance, right? He is very much dejected. Later on, we find that Eddie and Anne have become a legitimate couple, a true couple, right? The ring has been placed on her hand. And Lee visits her friend. At this point, she has lost the apartment. She has no money. And she needs to borrow money from her friend Anne, because this is her plan. She will go to Indianapolis to see if Joe shows up there. She still cares for him. Joe arrives in Indianapolis as a hobo. Hobos were vagrants, homeless people catching a train, going from town to beg or to work seasonally. And you can see transformation, dirty face, dirty used clothes, not elegant as he used to be. After he jumps off the train, we'll find him picking up half a banana from the ground and eating it because he's starved. He'll go team by team asking if they have a car for him. He wants to drive again or any other kind of job. And in this part of the scene, you find 6 or 7 famous drivers from the time. They're all actual drivers. And one after the other, they say, no, Joe, I'm sorry. They don't have a car for him. If they have a job as a mechanic for him, they feel it would be humiliating to use him, a former Indianapolis winner, as a lowly mechanic. Eddie is there driving a Duesenberg, a top car from the period. His career is going very well. This time, though, Joe stays away from him. He feels he cannot play the part of the older brother, the big brother any longer. He's not worthy of playing that role. He's humble, turning his eyes down and smiling because he's happy that his brother is successful. He's not pursuing his own success any longer. He gets to this place where drivers and mechanics go to eat, and the owner of the place recognizes him and says, okay, I see your situation. Come, I'll give you food. You don't have to pay. Don't worry, I'll give you as much food as you want. Turns to the waitress and says, go give this man whatever he wants. And of course, who's the waitress? Is the new, morally renewed Lee. And they have the first meeting as new people, right? And their relationship starts to change from here. It's not a relationship, again, the same way that he doesn't feel that he can truly, fully reconnect with his brother because he has failed his brother. He feels that he cannot ask her to get back with him because he feels that it's not worthy, that he has to work his way up again. She brings him to the apartment to have a serious conversation about him. Are you really a changed man? That's the essence of this dramatic conversation, shot very beautifully by the cinematographer, by the photographer of the film. The race, the Indianapolis race, starts. Car number 2 is the young brother Eddie. Each car at this point still has a mechanic on board to spot other cars and to work the mechanics of the car as well. So he's in the lead or close to the lead. However, there is a problem with the tire. The tire is shredded, explodes, and the shreds hit the elbow of Eddie. Blood comes out. He has to stop. He cannot be driving. So the car might be retired, but the announcer says, well, the car is back on the track. Who's driving? Eddie is driving. Now, Joe is driving. Now, the two brothers are driving together. During the portion of the race where the two brothers are driving together, there is an accident with smoke. It's not someone being burned to death, but there is smoke. And of course, this traumatizes Joe, who's lifting his foot off the accelerator, and it'll be his brother saying, no, push it down, let's go, you can do it. They also have a problem with the tire. They managed to win the race. This is the checkered flag. Number 2 is the car for which the checkered flag is waved. And right after they have an accident, they end up, this is the final scene, being taken by the hospital, but they're joking with each other. They're reconnected the same way that Joe is reconnected with his woman. So I'll show you 15 minutes from the initial sequence, and then we can continue on Tuesday.